All right, so this is where we left off in class before break in our lecture of accelerating towards disunion. So if you remember, we had just finished talking about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And so let me just kind of briefly go back over that, and then we'll get to the slide, which is obviously Bleeding Kansas. So in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, you have Stephen Douglas, who is an Illinois senator, and he's ambitious. He wants to become president someday. He wants to do things that are going to make him look good for the state of Illinois. And he knows that one of the things that will be economically beneficial politically to him, is to try to get a hub for the Transcontinental Railroad to really start with Chicago through his home state, and then go through the Northern Territories and end up around the Sacramento, and then end in the San Francisco area. And the reason he wants to do this is that, if you recall, we talked about that we had just kind of really opened up trade with both Japan and China. And so there is this idea that we're going to have a thriving trade with Asia. And, so we've got that. We've got the economic benefits of cross-country trade between places like New York and California, as California is a newly formed state. Remember that we've got the gold rush. And so we've got all these different reasons why a transcontinental railroad economically would be very good. And then, as I said, the political ramifications for Stephen Douglas is that he thinks this issue is going to propel him towards making a run at the presidency in the near future. So he gets his Kansas-Nebraska Act passed by trying to appeal to Southerners. He's got to do something to make this appealing to the South. Now, the South, on their end, they wanted a route to go from Houston to Los Angeles, and to that end, they had Congress had purchased the Gadsden Purchase in the South, and it looked like that there would be kind of this competing vision for a transcontinental railroad. So to get the Southerners' approval for his northern route, Stephen Douglas offers up the old Louisiana Territory. If you remember, the old Louisiana Purchase, by way of the Missouri Compromise, had been outlawed to slavery since 1820, and now here it is, 1854. And to get their approval, then you've got Douglas saying, hey, well, look, how about we just offer it as for an area of popular sovereignty, and we can let those areas decide. If you're the South, you like this because you thought that this area was completely off limits to slavery. Now there's a chance that this area could, at least a part of it, could become slavery territory. And that's exactly what's going to happen. Now, if you recall that once this act goes through, this does a lot of things politically. It's going to basically kill the Whigs, and it's going to start to split up the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party at this point in the 1850s is still a national party, but we're going to start to see, northern elements and southern elements. Northern elements being really for the choice of popular sovereignty. The southern elements of the Democrats are going to be very pro-slavery. So this is going to start breaking them up slowly over time, over the next 5 years. And then, of course, you've got the rise of the Republican Party. So that's kind of where we ended up last time, was by talking about kind of the can of worms that this Kansas-Nebraska Act created. And one of those problems then is going to be Kansas. It's very clear to most people that Nebraska, which was the bigger of the two territories, Nebraska would be not just Nebraska today, but good chunks of Montana and North and South Dakota. So, Nebraska was probably on its way to becoming a couple of states, and everybody knew that slavery was incompatible there. But the issue becomes Kansas. And if you can kind of see on the map, we know that Kansas is right next door to Missouri, which is a slave state. And then, Arkansas is not too close, or I'm sorry, not too far away from that. And so we start to see that pro-slavery people begin to fill over into Kansas, and the race is on to see who's going to be able to take over the territorial governor of Kansas, either free soil people. And I think it's important to point out, if you guys remember, Free soil does not mean abolition. Free soil is really a capitalist idea in which capitalist doesn't want to compete with slave labor, and so really that's the idea there. And so, as a result of this kind of this race between free soilers and pro-slavery people, tensions start to rise within Kansas. Well, it finally got to a point where there's enough people to vote for a territorial legislature in Kansas. And at that time, voter fraud, it wasn't that, there wasn't a lot of technology to be able to prevent voter fraud. And so apparently what had happened is that several thousand people from Missouri that were pro-slavery came across and voted in the Kansas territorial legislature elections. And they voted to create a government that would include slavery. As tensions continued to rise high, you can see on my map there, on May 21st in 1856, pro-slavery people went into the town of Lawrence. Now, in Lawrence, once the pro-slavery government had been created in Kansas, a number of people said, well, this is not legitimate, and so we're going to create a free soil government in Lawrence. And so at one point, you basically have two illegitimate governments, one that was created by a fraudulent vote from people coming over from Missouri to vote, and then others by, free soilers that said, well, that vote wasn't legitimate. And so we're going to create our own free town kind of free soil government in Lawrence. And so again, by 1856, you've got two governments operating in Kansas, and neither one of them are exactly legitimate. And you have a government in Washington D.C. that's not really willing to do anything to kind of take over the situation, and so it's a little bit of anarchy that's happening in Kansas. And so in May of 1856, you have a group of pro-slavery people that entered the town, the so-called free soil capital of Lawrence, Kansas, and they kill several people. They burn down the governor's house, the free soil governor's house. They basically just trash the town, and there's a pretty swift reaction from this. And one of those reactions to the sack of Lawrence is by the guy that you see in the picture down below. So I want you to take a look at the picture. It's not Abraham Lincoln. It kind of looks like Abraham Lincoln, but this is a guy by the name of John Brown. And John Brown is a very polarizing figure in American history. Even today there in Kansas, there are statues to John Brown. But he was an extremist, to say the least. And in a church one day, he basically made a pledge that he would give his life to make sure that slavery came to an end. And so after the sack of Lawrence, he and a couple of his sons and a couple of followers, they went to Pottawatomie Creek. Again, you might want to reference the map there. And on May 24th, 1856, as a response to the sack of Lawrence, they went in and they found in Pottawatomie people that they believed were associated with the sack of Lawrence. And they drugged them out of their houses in the middle of the night. They burned their houses down, and they hacked several pro-slavery people up right in front of their families in what is now known as the Pottawatomie Massacre. And so what this is really doing is this is almost like a prelude to the Civil War. This is like the opening scene to the Civil War. And you can see that America is being very polarized between this. There's not a lot of room for moderates now. You've got these people that are very, very ardently pro-slavery, or you're starting to get people like John Brown, who are like, and William Lloyd Garrison, who are saying, slavery, not another second. Slavery needs to be done away with. And Kansas is kind of the place where all this starts to play out. Okay, in the meantime, as Kansas is going on, literally this is happening within days of Kansas, the sack of Lawrence and the Pottawatomie Massacre, you have a debate that goes on in the Senate. And it starts, there's an event that starts with a guy by the name of Charles Sumner. Charles Sumner is a senator from Massachusetts, and he gives this speech, this very incendiary speech against what has gone on in Kansas and how, just vile the pro-slavery elements have been out west, and how illegitimate their government was. And really, Sumner just takes a stand against all the people that support the advancement of slavery into the Kansas territory. And in particular, one of those people that he singled out was a senator from South Carolina. Um, and this guy named Andrew Butler. And Charles Sumner just goes after him in Congress and just starts talking about how he is one of the people that has caused this violence that's happening out in Kansas, and that he's encouraging slavery to happen. And Butler's a very old man, and he's got a nephew that also serves in Congress, and his name is Preston Brooks. And Preston Brooks sees this as a tremendous insult against his uncle's honor. And I think we've talked about this before, but Southerners around this time, and even still today to some degree, but Southerners have this honor code, and they feel very slighted if you insult them in any way. And so that when they did get insulted, a lot of times they would have duels or something like that. And Brooks, Butler's nephew, he knew that Sumner would not duel with him, and so he kind of brooded about it and stewed about this for a couple of days, and finally he had had enough, and so he went into the Senate chamber where Sumner was working after one of the sessions of Congress, took a cane, and as you can see in the picture, just basically just started beating the living daylights out of Charles Sumner. And so in the North, Preston Brooks is viewed as this bully. They call him Bully Brooks. And of course, Sumner becomes a martyr for the free soil and anti-slavery cause. In the South, Preston Brooks is seen as this great hero. He had beaten Sumner so hard that he broke his cane, and Southerners bestowed new canes on him. There was even a golden cane that was given to him by a wealthy merchant in the South. And so again, this is one of those things where it really polarizes not just America, but in Congress as well. All right, so that is happening again right on the heels of Bleeding Kansas. And really, as Bleeding Kansas is going on, now you've got violence in the Senate. You've got things really kind of ratcheting up for America in May of 1856. And it all stems really from the Kansas-Nebraska Act that opened this can of worms. You see this quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson kind of portends the future a little bit. I do not see how a barbarous community, a civilized community, can constitute one state. We must either get rid of slavery or get rid of freedom. And that is how people started thinking. We either, have to get rid of slavery and move forward as a country, or, we've got to just accept it or just let it tear us apart. All right. 1856 is an election year. You can see that the Democrats at this point are still doing pretty well. You can see that they constitute a national party because they still win states in the North. So if you take a look at New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Illinois, those are states that are, really in the North, but still kind of going for Democrats, even California way out west. The Republican candidate was a war hero from the Mexican-American War, John C. Fremont. Remember, he helped to actually conquer California. And remember that Republicans at this point, they're free soilers. They are starting to get a lot of the moderate people that are not abolitionists, but they're becoming a little bit more extreme. But for right now, we want to think of the Republicans as very much a moderate type party. And probably the most extreme national group right now are the Northern Whigs. And then a lot of the Northern Whigs are starting to push for, if not just free soil, but also for, popular sovereignty. They don't like the idea of popular sovereignty, whereas The Republicans are at least okay with popular sovereignty as far as um, people vote against it, but they don't like slavery going to the new territories. So that's something we need to remember about the Republicans. They do not like slavery going to the territories. They are not in support of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They are against it. All right, so James Buchanan has a very distinguished political career. He's been serving in the government since I think like 1815 is when he comes in. Um, he's a Pennsylvanian, but he's very much supported by a strong pro-slavery congressional base. And Buchanan, history is going to see him as somebody that really wasn't a strong personality. He kind of had events occur and reacted to them more than he tried to, to shape history. And so we're going to take a look at those three major events that kind of doomed him and really doomed him in his first couple of years in office. And really, history is going to remember him as somebody that was kind of indecisive during critical moments when when Lincoln, who follows him, was brilliant in those decisive moments. All right, so the first kind of event that undoes Buchanan, and again, some of these are probably out of his control a little bit, but nevertheless, the way that he responded to them probably didn't help his popularity, especially in the North. All right, so the first case is called the first event is called Dred Scott versus Sanford, and you can see I have a D in there. Really, the person's name, the Army general that was, or the U.S. Army surgeon, excuse me, that was the owner of Dred Scott. They had misspelled his name in the court case, so sometimes you'll see it as Sandford or Sanford, but just know it's that's the case, is Dred Scott. All right, so in the case of Dred Scott was a kind of a domestic servant for a U.S. Army surgeon, and that U.S. Army surgeon moved around a lot. I mean, he was in the military, and so he moved to Missouri, he moved to Illinois, he moved to Wisconsin, and when he moved to those places, he took Dred Scott with him, and Dred Scott ended up in one of the, I think it was in Wisconsin. He found a wife and got married, and he had a couple of kids. And then when the surgeon passed away as property, Dred Scott was given to the U.S. Army surgeon's brother back down in Missouri, and back down in where slavery would be legal. And so what Dred Scott did is he sued for his freedom, and he actually initially won. His grounds was that when the U.S. Army surgeon took him up to the north into a free area, then he became free. And so the brother of the U.S. Army surgeon kind of basically countersued or appealed, and the case kind of worked its way up through the state Supreme Court and then eventually to the National Supreme Court. And finally, when the case got to the National Supreme Court, then it became kind of a big deal. Well, unfortunately for Dred Scott, this was a pretty powerful ruling, not only against him, but against the idea of popular sovereignty. So let's talk about that. So first of all, the Supreme Court at this time was controlled by the vast majority of Southerners. And those Southerners were also slave owners, and they had no sympathy for Dred Scott. And so at the most basic level of the ruling of the Dred Scott case was that slaves were not even considered citizens, and they could not even sue in a court of law. So the case was dismissed, and Dred Scott was basically sent back into slavery with the U.S. Army surgeon's brother. But Roger Taney, who you can see up there kind of seated up here, he kept going, and he ruled that not only was Dred Scott not free, but that if you take a look at the Missouri Compromise land that Dred Scott had been taken to, that area was an area where the U.S. government controlled it. And Roger Taney argued that if you try to take slaves away from any part of that area, whether it has popular sovereignty or not, that would be denying property owners of their property, which slaves were considered to be at this time, and that would be a violation of the Fifth Amendment. So that's kind of an interesting aspect, is that we're, if you're the Supreme Court, you're justifying the Constitution to keep people in slavery. You're using the Bill of Rights to keep people in slavery, and that's what they did in this ruling. Now, the Southerners, they of course loved this ruling, and they many of them wanted to go so far as they wanted a federal slave code that would protect slavery from wherever it was in the United States. It would never allow the chance of the United States ever getting rid of slavery. And of course, the Northerners, a lot of the Northerners were outraged by this ruling, and they feared that the Southerners wanted to control the government. And that's what this is really all about. This is all about control of government and who's going to be able to control the national government. And I've said this to you guys in class before, but once the South feels like they don't have a voice in government, then they start leaving the government really quickly. But that's kind of what this is all about. And this causes an uproar in the country as well. So again, here you have more issues that polarize the differences between the North and the South. All right. Meanwhile, back out in Kansas. Okay. The pro-slavery legislature had taken matters into their own hand. They wrote a state constitution that would include slavery. And that constitution was known as the Lecompton Constitution. When it came time to vote for it, the anti-slavery forces in the territory, they refused to vote. Now, that probably wasn't the smartest thing to do. So, of course, the pro-slavery legislature was able to pass their Lecompton Constitution, and they were able to get it temporarily passed. Well, then the anti-slavery people, they held their own constitutional convention. They were able to make sure that the Lecompton Constitution did not pass, and they had to wait for the population to get to 90,000 before they could get into the Union, which they finally do. All told, you have a situation where in Kansas you had two illegitimate governments. You have basically two illegitimate constitutions that were written. Kansas holds out for a while, and then finally during the Civil War, they are made into a free state. So after all this is done, Kansas is going to wait a couple of years, and then they finally come in 1861 as a free state. So kind of a mess. All right, another issue that affects Buchanan during this time, the third of the big issues, is going to be the Panic of 1857. So if you're kind of keeping score here, remember we had Panic of 1819, the Panic of 1837, and now we have the Panic of 1857. This one is mostly caused by over-speculation or overproduction of manufacturing forces in the North. Now, they're also upset at this time. The South had worked the tariff down to its lowest level since 1816, and so they feel like that's one of the problems, is that their prices are dropping, and they're not protected by this tariff, and so that's leading to foreign competition as well. Also going on at this time, we have a situation where foreign demand for grain, so like wheat and rye and barley and corn, is at a kind of a low, and so that hurts the country. And then, of course, the banking system. Remember, we don't have a Bank of the United States, and so the state banks are allowed to give out loans, which they typically do too often. And that leads to a run on banks during panics. And so we have this Panic of 1857 that goes on for a couple of years. And so leading up to the election of 1860, we've had a kind of a prolonged economic recession. Now, the Panic of 1857, it becomes, kind of sectional. The Northerners blame the South for low tariffs. And the South, they're really not hurt by the Panic of 1857 as much as the North. We don't see as much in terms of unemployment or people getting hurt by this in the South, because cotton demand stays pretty high, and they're able to kind of weather the storm and not get as hit by as hard in the Panic of 1857 as compared to the North. And so the North kind of blames the South for this. All right, we're going to move forward here to 1858, and we're going to talk about the state of Illinois. And the reason we talk about the state of Illinois is because it's going to produce two people that we're going to see in a couple of years that are going to be running for the presidency. But at this time, in 1858, we're going to see them run for a seat in the Senate. Now, keep in mind that at this time, that the incumbent is Stephen Douglas, and Stephen Douglas is the guy that we know that helped get past um, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. He is kind of the Henry Clay of the 1850s. He is a very brilliant man, but very forceful in personality, and that has kind of upset his chances to become a national kind of force. But at the time in 1858, he is still a very formidable force, and he's challenged by Abraham Lincoln. So it's probably a good time now to talk about Abraham Lincoln. Before we get to the debates. So Abraham Lincoln, we the earliest that we see Abraham Lincoln is way back in the 1830s in the Black Hawk War. And then he gets elected to the Illinois legislature. And then finally, by the 1840s, he gets elected into the National Congress. And if you remember back in the 1840s during the Mexican American War, Lincoln kind of made a name for himself coming up with these things called the spot resolutions, where he demanded that President Polk put forth the exact spot where the Mexicans attacked America, because he believed that America had actually incited the Mexican-American War, not the other way around. But after that, Lincoln kind of retires from politics, and he might have well stayed out of politics. He opened up a law firm in Illinois, but by the mid 1850s, it is literally the Kansas-Nebraska Act that gets him back into politics, and so he really starts to embrace this idea of free soil and not allowing slavery to extend into these newly formed territories. So obviously, he was against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which meant that he was against Stephen Douglas, and so this prompts him to run for the Illinois Senate seat that is up for re-election. And so he challenges Stephen Douglas to a series of debates that now we call the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, a series of 7 debates during the 1858 election, of which probably the most important of these debates was in Freeport, Illinois, and the Freeport Doctrine. And in the Freeport Doctrine, it really solidifies the ideas of both of the men, in that Lincoln kind of tries to trap Douglas into saying, well, what if the people in these newly formed territories, what if they decide that they want slavery? And Douglas said, well, according to popular sovereignty, then that would be okay. And what Lincoln is really trying to do there is to get the northern elements of the Democrats to be upset by this, because the northern Democrats, they really don't want that. They want they want popular sovereignty to really go the other way. They want it to be to where it's free soil up that way. And so the Southerners, of course, they like this, but this is kind of splitting the Democrats. You've got the northern Democrats that are really for popular sovereignty, and then you've got the pro-slavery Democrats who they don't want to hear popular sovereignty. They just want slavery protected in these territories, and that's what Lincoln really was doing with this so-called Freeport Doctrine. Is he's really trying to split up the Democrats. And so, in a way, even though Lincoln ends up losing the Senate seat, it's kind of like he's losing the battle to win the war. So by 1860, when Lincoln runs for president, he's going to find that the Democrats are too weak to challenge him. And so they, because of this Freeport Doctrine, the Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats are split, and they end up casting for president two candidates instead of one, and that's going to allow Lincoln to eventually win. So that's why the Lincoln-Douglas debates are kind of important in the scope of what we're talking about in the 1860 election. All right. again, 1858, 1859, we're really starting to get close to the breaking up of our country. And one of the most polarizing events, we've talked about some other Dred Scott case. We talked about Bleeding Kansas. We talked about, um, the attack in the Senate by Preston Brooks on Charles Sumner. This was another one, and that is John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Now, if you remember, I talked about John Brown, in the context of Bleeding Kansas and his role in the Potawatomi massacre. And so after that, he's kind of laid low and kind of been on the lam, and he worked his way back east. And he had an idea where he and his sons, he had like 3 or 4 sons, they were going to seize the federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which today would actually be West Virginia. And from there, they were going to launch an all-out attack throughout the South on any plantation or place that had slavery. And so if they were able to seize this arsenal, they would get a cache of guns, and then they were going to go on just a rampage throughout the South and go from plantation to plantation and free slaves. And hopefully the idea would be that the slaves would join with them, and that they would be able to free all the slaves, and it'd be just a momentum of freedom as they went through the South. Well, as it turned out, it didn't work out quite that way. And so what ends up happening is that militiamen, the U.S. Army actually comes to defend its arsenal. And what's kind of interesting about that is that the U.S. Army sent a lieutenant colonel by the name of Robert E. Lee and his right-hand man, Jeb Stuart. Now, eventually, these are going to be two of the leading Confederate generals here in a couple of years, but right now they're working for the U.S. Army, and so they come in, they surround John Brown, they end up capturing John Brown, they end up killing, I think, a couple of John Brown's sons. The whole plot is foiled, and they put John Brown on trial. They end up finding him guilty, and they hang him, and he becomes an instant martyr. And really, this event further polarizes the North and the South, and stake on a lot of the moderates, and it's kind of pushing them into these extreme camps. Now, in terms of the South, they're a little freaked out. They think, well, how many of these John Brown type characters are out there that are that are going to try to come to the South and free our slaves? And so the South again doubles down, and they start drilling their militias and making sure that if they are invaded by the North, that they are ready. All right, so that brings us to the election of 1860. And I think the big thing that I pointed out a little bit earlier in the Lincoln-Douglas debates is what that Freeport Doctrine ends up doing in terms of the Democrats. You've got Stephen Douglas, who is still touting his popular sovereignty, but a lot of the northern Democrats, they're not really for the extension of slavery, because they really want popular sovereignty to mean free soil. Then you've got the Southerners, led by a guy named John Breckinridge, and really their idea is, let's make sure we get as much slave territory as possible. For the Republicans, we have Abraham Lincoln, and really they are kind of a coalition of free soilers. They are not abolitionists, but they are definitely against the extension of slavery into the newly formed territories, and that's really their biggest campaign issue. That being said, the Democrats, the Southern Democrats, led by John Breckinridge, they see that Abraham Lincoln, they think he's an abolition candidate, and if he gets elected, they don't want any part of a government ran by him or his people. Now, interestingly enough, in the middle, you have kind of a moderate group where they're literally stuck in the middle in more ways than one. And so they coalesce under a guy by the name of John Bell and create a kind of almost like a third major party called the Constitutional Union. And really, these are people that are pro-slavery, but they're also tied to wanting to keep the Union together. So kind of an interesting dynamic there. You typically think of the pro-slavery elements as people that are wanting to concede, but these areas are in the middle. They know that if there is going to be a civil war, that probably their territory would be where it would go down, and they don't necessarily want that. And then you've got a lot of people that are devoted to the Union. So even though they're devoted to slavery, they're also devoted to keeping the Union together. And so they create kind of a middle ground uh, party for that, and they do reasonably well. They really do, better than Breckinridge did for the most part. You got Breckinridge and I'm sorry, Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas really only gets one state. He gets the state of Missouri. But I think what's probably really important about this is if we take a look at this electoral map, is the sectional outcome for this, and now we've got Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, who voted for Buchanan back in 1856. Now you have them voting for Abraham Lincoln in 1860, and so you can see it's very polarized between the North and the South. Even though Lincoln only gets a plurality of the popular vote, he wins pretty well. You can see up there in the electoral vote, gets nearly 60% of the electoral vote. Now, once the election happens, the South sees this as the writing on the wall. They believe that Lincoln's going to come after slavery, even though he was never on record of ever saying that. The Southern states, they see this as the end of them having power. They don't have the House anymore. They don't have the Senate. Now they've lost the executive branch to a Northerner, and as a result, they feel like this is the only way out, is to start seceding from the Union. And so what we're going to see pretty quickly by December of 1860, South Carolina being the first state to issue an ordinance of succession, and then followed by 7 other states by the time that Lincoln is inaugurated on March 4th. Now, there was a last-ditch effort in which they were going to, a senator from Kentucky named Crittenden had proposed this idea that would protect slavery even in the territories and make slavery to where, it would be something that they could never get rid of. And the Northerners just weren't willing to go along with that. And so the Crittenden Compromise really fails. And at that point, there's kind of nothing to do but really kind of decide, if you're Lincoln, are you going to allow these Southern states to secede, or are you going to keep them in? Now, South Carolina becomes a flashpoint for this. So down in Charleston Harbor, there is a federal fort called Fort Sumter at this time. And Fort Sumter is controlled by the Union forces, by the federal forces. But the problem is they only have enough supplies to hold out for a couple of months. And the South starts going after these federal forts. And so Lincoln has kind of a decision to make. Is he going to allow this fort to be taken over by the South, or is he going to defend it as federal property? And so he decides that he's going to defend Fort Sumter as federal property. They go to supply it, and the South basically opens fire. And for 30 hours, they unleash, nonstop cannon fire on Fort Sumter, which finally ends in the South winning. And this is really kind of the opening battle, April 12th, 1861, the beginning of the Civil War. And so Fort Sumter is pretty universally regarded as the first battle of the Civil War. Now, once Fort Sumter happens, the South takes over Fort Sumter. They raise this newly Confederate flag that is now flying over Fort Sumter, and almost immediately Lincoln creates a naval blockade, and he ends up calling for volunteers. And just like that, we're going to be at war with the both sections going at each other. So that's where we'll pick up next time. All right, thank you for tuning in, and have a good rest of your break.